pleasure to briefly introduce our three panelists who certainly do not need long introduction. Delphine Horvilleur is a French rabbi, author of several essays, and managing editor of Cutler's Review. She worked as a journalist for the French television, serving notably in the Middle East office in Jerusalem. She then studied at the Hebrew Union College in New York, and there she was ordained as a rabbi. She's one of the founding members of Kerem, the Council of French-speaking liberal rabbis, and she works as a rabbi for Judaisme Mouvement, a community affiliated with the World Union of Progressive Judaism. Isaac Herzog is chairman of the executive of the Jewish Agency for Israel. An attorney by profession, he had a long career in Israeli politics as member of Knesset, chairman of the Israeli Labor Party, Knesset opposition leader, and also having held several ministerial posts. Isaac Herzog stems from one of Israel's most prominent families. His grandfather was the first chief rabbi of Israel. His father was president of Israel. David Harris has led the AJC, the American Jewish Committee, since 1990. Described by the late Israeli President Shimon Peres as the foreign minister of the Jewish people, he has been invited to speak at some of the world's most prestigious forums. He's been honored more than 20 times, including by 13 countries, for his international efforts in defense of human rights, advancement of the transatlantic partnership, and dedication to the Jewish people. So welcome all of you in our virtual conversation here in Washington, D.C. When the State of Israel was established, less than 10% of the Jewish people lived in a Jewish state. Today, almost every second Jew lives in Israel. And even though there is a growing Israeli diaspora worldwide, if present trends continue, more than half of the Jewish population will soon be residing in Israel. And as we know, it's always been in Israel's interest to nurture Jewish life in the diaspora. As the latest attempt, let me quote, this July, the Israeli government issued what they called a comprehensive strategic framework for ensuring the continued existence and unity of the world Jewish community. The unity of the Jewish people, if it ever existed, seems today more at stake than ever. In recent years, we have seen political and religious changes that affect the relationship between the diaspora communities and Israel. So let me begin with a general question to all of you. How would you describe the general state of Israel diaspora affairs from your point of view today? And how did it change over the last 2 decades? So basically since the beginning of this century. And keep in mind that our time is limited and we want to include questions from our audience later. So keep your answers short and let me begin with this question, maybe with you, Chairman Herzog.
Thank you very much, Professor Brenner. It's an honor to be here. I want to thank especially my colleagues, Rabbi Delphine Horvilleur, a great friend, and Mr. David Harris, another great friend. I'm sure it's going to be a fascinating discussion. What brought me on board from politics to lead the biggest Jewish organization in the world, the Jewish Agency, was exactly this question. Namely, how do we keep our people united, or how do we, how do we prevent a historical irreversible split? I do identify 2 major Jewish communities who are the pillars right now of the Jewish world, although there are many, many all around the world. But let's say that Israel and North America are the 2 main pillars, each one around 6.5 million Jews. I call it Jerusalem and Babylon. I say in ancient times they produced 2 different Talmuds, but they did correspond with each other. And I say to today, despite the fact that Israel is very central to American Jewry, there are cracks. And there are quarters where Israel is kind of fading away from its centrality in those quarters. and they're looking for alternatives. And we must make sure that there is no split. Now, there are dark spots because of the different lifestyles of Judaism all over, but there are also very positive spots. There is a huge amount of interaction between all parts of Judaism. In many places, they all convene together, and you see all rabbis and all kippot and all groups. Even in Israel, there are some changes, which I'll be happy to elaborate further on, of a very important nature. And of course, there is the discussion of the average Jewish person outside Israel about what he or she feels about Israel as such, namely its policies or what is how it's depicted in his own community. These are major questions which also obliges the Israelis to know so much more about Jewish life abroad, something which we've put as a central pillar of our agenda.
Let's go to the other big center first and ask David Harris how he sees that.
It's a very large question, Michael, as you know, and I don't think I can do it justice in just 280 characters or so. But I would say this: the American Jewish community today numbers, depending on who you believe, as many as 6.8 million Jews. It's impossible to categorize 6.8 million Jews monolithically. So in effect, you can find in today's American Jewish community whatever thesis it is you're looking to present. Strong, resilient bonds, as Isaac Herzog said, absolutely. Incredibly strong, resilient bonds. Attenuated bonds, you can find that as well. Alienated bonds, you can find that as well. What are the trends that affect this climate and that, at least from my perspective, need to focus on the first group, which is ensuring that the core of American Jewry remains close to Israel and finds it not just politically important, but, if you will, metaphysically important, metaphysically. And here we're dealing with several trends. Number one, unlike Jews in Europe, for example, if I can generalize, and I defer to Delphine, of course, American Jews have seen themselves historically as an exception to the Zionist belief that the diaspora would sort of wither and disappear with the reestablishment of sovereignty in Israel. We are geographically more distant than Europe. If one looks at surveys of American Jews and European Jews, far fewer American Jews have visited Israel. Far fewer American Jews today have close relatives, and far fewer Jews feel Israel not just in their head, but in their heart and in their soul. Number two, there's been in some important parts of American Jewry an attenuation of Jewish identity. This is a larger question. But as part of that attenuation of Jewish identity, less connection to Israel. After all, if one feels less Jewish, then why would one necessarily feel close to Israel in the way that others might? Number three, I think for some American Jews, Michael, there's also been some difficulty in adjusting to the new reality. When American Jews were the kind of beneficent uncle, helping their poorer brethren and cousins in sort of emerging Israel, it was one thing. Israel today is a strong, powerful, successful nation with all of its daily challenges. It's a huge success story. It's an amazing success story. And I think for American Jews, there's also a need to adjust to the reality that the Israel of today is a global powerhouse. And that creates a whole new set of realities about what it means to be connected to Israel. And I would just add, and again, Isaac Herzog and the Jewish Agency have been leaders in this field. It also requires a reminder and an education to Israelis of why the diaspora matters, why the diaspora is more than just a fundraising source, or a cheerleading section, but why it's an integral part of the Jewish people, and why this relationship continues to be not just important, but mutually important and mutually beneficial.
Thank you, David. And I'll turn to Europe now, to Rabbi Horvilleur. And having grown up myself in Europe, I know how often Europe is in a way ignored as a Jewish center. In terms of numbers, that may be true, but in terms of tradition, I think Europe still plays a big role in our consciousness of what the Jewish world constitutes. But I turn to you and would like to ask you about the specific, about your specific perspective on this question of Israeli diaspora relations, how they have changed over the last two decades with respect to France and Europe.
Yes. First of all, thank you for this invitation. I'm so happy to spend this time with you. Generally, I live in Paris, but I'm talking to you now from Brussels. I'm giving a lecture tonight here in Brussels. And actually, I'm teaching about, we are starting again this week the reading of Parashat Bereshit, starting again the reading of the Torah from the very beginning. And it's a very good time to think about starting again and what it means to be able to renew something in our life. And it's particularly relevant to think about it in time of crisis as the one we are experiencing today. You know, in Hebrew, the word mashber has something to do in the Bible with a birthing stool, like the ability to, envision in a time of crisis how things could be different, could be renewed. And I think it's particularly relevant to our discussion. So I was lucky in the past 20 years, actually exactly the time you're mentioning now, I was lucky in the past 20 years to live in France, in Israel, and in America. So I had the experience of these three nations and the way they envision their identity, their contribution to the world, and their Jewish contribution to the world. And actually, I think it's quite striking because there is a common feature between these three countries, is that each one of them somehow considers it has a kind of universal message to bring to the world. Like America brings this idea of like bringing freedom to the world, and France considers it brings equality and the notion of equality to the world, like or lagoyim, like a light unto the nation. And Israel also contributes to this notion of like recreation and safety and security. And I think it's very relevant for our discussion, actually, that we tend to perceive our place in the world and even our Jewish history as being somehow being made up too much of strength or of vulnerabilities. And I think, for example, for my French Jewish experience, it's been particularly relevant in recent years when people think about the French Jewish experience, they tend to think only of its vulnerability, of its lack of strength in a way. And I think it would be very interesting as a way to renew our relationships today and to strengthen our relationship, to be able to feel how much each one of us is actually full of strength and weaknesses and so much vulnerable upon the other. We are in time of sanitary crisis, and it's a time that reminds to each one of us how much we are actually vulnerable and how much each one of us is in need of the other. And I think it could be a very powerful model today to rethink our diaspora-Israeli relationships, to be able to put forward both our strength and our vulnerabilities and our deep need for each other.
Thank you. Thank you all for these opening statements. And I want to go right into one of those cracks, which Isaac Herzog mentioned before. Let's keep the political out for a moment. Let's start with the religious question, which in a way divides, of course, large parts of the Jewish diaspora in Israel. As we all know, in Israel, only the Orthodox are really recognized and have official functions, and other denominations within Judaism have a second-class position. At the same time, in Israel, in America, most Jews belong either to the conservative or reform movements. So we know in the last few years there were some committees and attempts to bridge the gap, especially in Israel, but also among world Jewish leaders, attempts to introduce more pluralistic prayers at the Western Wall, attempts to broaden the recognition of non-Orthodox conversions, and maybe in general to just broaden the recognition of non-Orthodox in Israel, non-Orthodox Jews in Israel. Let me maybe start in this case with the Rabbi. Rabbi Horvilleur, how do you see, having lived, of course, in all three places, how do you see this development? Do you have any suggestion how we can bridge this gap, which is visible for any person who affiliates with the religious denomination?
Well, in the past years, I was lucky to take part in many of these conversations, sometimes official, sometimes not official conversations between denominations. And what I learned from these intra-religious dialogues is that very often they are much more difficult than inter-religious dialogue. You know, it's much more difficult to dialogue inside a house than it is to dialogue between different faiths. But it all comes back to a very simple idea, which I could summarize in a very simple way, and it could be summarized this way. Are you willing in your world, in your religious world, to make room for otherness? And actually, this question of intra-religious dialogue is key, I would say even theologically. Are you willing to make room for other figures? Are you willing to make room for femininity, for women, for converted? Are you willing to make room for other families, for other models of behavior? It's actually, for me, it's a very philosophical and theological question. That's why I think it's so critical for Jewish leaders and for the Jewish state today to be able to show and to really to show a model of openness. And again, I was blessed to live in 3 different countries in the past 20 years, and it's quite obvious that the situation is very, very different in America than it is today in Europe and in Israel. But I think the crisis we're going through is for me an opportunity to rethink more generally the will we're having to make room for others and to define what could be a pluralistic model, including a religious pluralistic model.
Yes, thank you. And let's go to David Harris. So we just heard that it is, and I agree, very often very often harder to overcome the gaps within the house, within the family, than reaching out to other religions in that case. I know the American Jewish Committee also has tried a lot to bridge it. Where do you think we are, and what has really to be done next?
Well, Michael, let me begin very personally, just to humanize, give a human face to the story. My eldest son married a beautiful Israeli girl. They were married in Washington, D.C. By the way, she was doing her LLM at American University. So I can give a shout out to the sponsoring university here. And they went to a judge's chamber and they received a civil marriage certificate and they were married. But of course they wanted to be married in Israel. But they wanted to be married in Israel, if you will, honestly, consistent with their own beliefs. And so they were married by, and Delphine may know him, Rabbi Azari, Meir Azari, who was a liberal rabbi, and under a chuppah in Israel. Now, the irony of the story, of course, and I'm sure many viewers know, is that their civil certificate in Washington, D.C. was recognized in Israel as the legal basis for their marriage. But their marriage under a chuppah in Tel Aviv by Rabbi Azari, an Israeli citizen whose wife serves as Israel's ambassador to Poland, and I think soon to Russia, was not recognized. I mean, for me, yes, in this sense, I guess I'm positively infected by the American spirit of pluralism. I have always understood, both in American society, but also in Jewish peoplehood, the recognition that we are many on different paths, leading in the same direction, with the same destiny. So I know that for many American Jews, Michael, these issues of non-recognition, or if you will, partial or stunted recognition, are major obstacles to the fulfillment of their relationship with Israel. People like me are able to compartmentalize, meaning we're able to be upset about the issues you referenced, the Kotel, marriage, divorce, even questions about who is and who is not a rabbi, who can and who cannot oversee conversion. These issues have spilled over into the Israel-U.S. relationship on many, many occasions. I'm able to compartmentalize because my love of Israel allows me to put it into a larger context. On the other hand, I fear that there are some American Jews for whom this cannot be easily compartmentalized. The basic view, and I'm simplifying, being if Israel is not willing to recognize me or my spouse or my rabbi as an authentic Jew, then why should I devote my time and attention to Israel? The last thing I would say is, from my experience, and I've also spent a lot of time, my family, Delphine, is from France, my mother and my father, and I've also obviously spent a lot of time in Israel. Most Israelis, from my experience, agree with what Delphine said and what I'm saying. And yet when it comes to political behavior, voting behavior, this issue does not rise high enough in order to shape people's decisions on who to choose. Issues of economy and security and trust tend to overshadow. And I understand that. But I hope one day that large and quiet center in Israel that agrees with this and that has concerns about the monopoly by the chief rabbinate, a very different chief rabbinate than Isaac Herzog's grandfather, that they will come to recognize that this is an impediment to the notion of Am Echad, of one people, which I think is so central to Sachnut's worldview, to the American Jewish Committee's worldview, and if I may say, to Delphine's worldview, to the extent that I know her.
So first of all, I want to go from the ideal situation to the facts on the ground, because I do not believe this issue will be resolved by a revolution. It can only be changed by evolution. First of all, I explained to everybody, it's not that Israel doesn't recognize each and every one of our brothers and sisters abroad. Israel actually does recognize, and each and every one of our viewers and any other Jew from all over the world can make Aliyah and become an Israeli citizen automatically, disregarding his or her congregation or denomination. And we, the Jewish Agency, deal with it. We know it all the time. Who doesn't recognize the other streams, the Reform and Conservative, is the Rabbanut, the chief rabbinate. But it doesn't mean that you cannot get married in Israel by other means, just as you mentioned. I know it's not the ideal way, but it's not that you're not recognized. You're recognized for all intents and purposes. You can't just hold a marriage ceremony under the Rabbanut. Now, that's a big difference of rhetoric, because for many years this wasn't an issue. It evolved dramatically in the last 15 years, correctly so, because, and this is another important development, because of the substantial growth of Reform and Conservative congregations in Israel, way above what people understand or know, or other non-denominational congregations who are bringing built all around the country in a very interesting process. Thirdly, the big issue in my mind is the lack of dialogue and understanding and knowledge what various Jewish lifestyles and beliefs are all about, what these denominations are all about. The average Israeli was either secular or Orthodox. He had no clue of either on the other side. He didn't know what Jewish life is abroad, never understood what Reform or conservative life was. The Reform movement went into Israel only in the 1960s, so it kind of leaped only behind. And this is an educational process. When today we have tens of thousands of Israeli emissaries, shlichim, of the Jewish Agency who came back from living abroad in Jewish communities, they are delivering a message of what it is pluralistic way of life. And there is a clear change in the perception of Israelis about what the content of Jewish life we would like to have. And as a signal of that, I can tell you that personally for the last 2 years in my capacity, I've been speaking to all religious leaders of the most polarized positions, and I find much more love of Israel between all streams than people understand. And this was also mentioned in various forums, including the Cabinet of Israel, including by ultra-Orthodox leaders, that are the Reform and Conservative are our brothers and sisters, but we have an opinion about what should be the nature of the Jewish state. Now, recently there was actually a watershed event, because whilst in America, rabbis of all denominations convene together in any forum and speak to each other with no limitations, in Israel it didn't happen yet. And this is a major issue, major stumbling block, major mental block in the discussion between the groups. Well, Delphine Horvilleur was the first one to hold a dialogue with Rabbi Eliezer Melamed, who was a very, very famous and well-known rabbi of the Zionist religious Orthodox movement, who lives in Har Bacha settlement with the West Bank. And this was a very major, dramatic event, which was depicted all over the religious press in Israel. And Rabbi Melamed then went and published 3 more articles about saying why we have to have a dialogue with our Reform brothers and sisters, which was a major watershed and which definitely reflects an undercurrent which should be encouraged in a smart way, in a dialogue. Less confrontation, but more of a dialogue. In my mind, there is a direction for change if we push forward for a dialogue.
Yes, I want to add it was a very indeed respectful dialogue, and I was very impressed by the level of communication we could have. Many people told me beforehand it wouldn't be possible, and I'm very grateful for the organizers of this dialogue. That was very powerful.
But Delphine, you agree with me that nobody in the Jewish world knows about it, meaning everybody likes the position of saying everything is doomsday, everything is irreversible, it's all tragic relationship. Well, guys, there is much more of a change in what's going on in the field than people understand or are told about.
Okay, I hope we will see the results on ground also very soon. And I know you and your organizations, of course, are working towards it, but not everybody in Israel. And of course, every religious issue is also a political issue in Israel.
Very explosive.
So that is, of course, not a little bit on the way. So let me build a bridge now to the next question. And my last one for this round, then we go to the questions from the audience. And I hope we will also deepen this religious question a little bit in the audience. Obviously, there is also political divide. And now I think especially about American Jews and Israeli Jews. Let me put it that way. I would say if today the majority of American Jews would elect, let's say there would be direct election, would elect the Prime Minister of Israel, they would probably elect a different Prime Minister of Israel as Israeli Jews. If the majority of Israeli Jews would vote for the American president, they would probably vote very differently than the majority of American Jews. Now, this is a hypothetical question, but of course, what it shows us is that there is a divide. I would put it, very crudely, that we have a majority of liberal, politically liberal Jews in America versus a more right-wing voters among the Jewish public in Israel. And the question is also how to divide this gap, which I think we see increasingly when we talk about the diaspora, the American Jewish diaspora versus Israel. And we'll come to Europe in a minute, but let's maybe start with this. David, would you start with what I would say, is, despite all solidarity, something we all witness?
So, Michael, you're giving us a very big challenge, which is extremely important questions and little time to respond. So I apologize in advance for being telegraphic. But I agree essentially with your assessment. And again, allow me to generalize, understanding that every generalization is risky and problematic. But in America, to a large degree, American Jews have embraced sort of the philosophical notion of universalism. I'll call it in Jewish terms, tikkun olamism, as their religion. And if I'm right, that a large segment have embraced tikkun olamism, which essentially means a kind of universalism, then it leads them to, in one direction politically, which is largely in what might be termed a liberal, progressive direction. And if we look at exit results from every American presidential election since 1932, with only one exception, in 1980, American Jews have, in majority terms, always voted for the Democratic candidate. As high as, I think, 88% in 1992, but always certainly over the 50 to 60% mark, with the exception of Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter. And then if you ask more recently, Michael, a question which the American Jewish Committee does ask in many of our surveys of American Jews, how important are various issues to you in your decision how to vote? I'm sorry to say, from my perspective, that Israel too often does not rank terribly high. So other issues, all very legitimate issues, economic issues, social issues, environmental issues, gender issues, tend to rate higher than Israel. So, and then if you add to it one more factor, Michael, which we see on many American campuses, perhaps on American universities' campus, you would know better than I, but in many parts of America, Israel's detractors have succeeded in depicting Israel as an illiberal political cause. Meaning, if today you stand up proudly for Israel politically, for the U.S.-Israel relationship, you tend to be put together with the Republican Party, with the evangelicals, with the so-called right wing, and what once upon a time was a very liberal cause, Israel in its early years, has now largely given way to this new narrative. So put it all together: universalism, tikkun olamism, liberalism, and a kind of declining connection to Israel for some, for a large chunk. I think this helps explain much of the divide, at least from the American Jewish perspective. And the last thing I would say, if I may, Michael, is I think, and here I speak analytically, I think for many American Jews as well, there's a very big difficulty in grasping what sovereignty means and how to factor sovereignty into their sense of Jewish identity. In other words, if I'm an American Jew living in New York City, as I am, and I go to a wonderful synagogue with an Argentine rabbi on Friday evening and lots of great music, and by the end of the evening, this is pre-COVID and I hope post-COVID, we're all swaying back and forth, arm in arm, singing together, chanting together, It's a wonderfully fulfilling and enriching form of Jewish identity. But how does one reconcile that form of Jewish identity, that expression, with another reality, which is Israel as a sovereign state cannot limit itself to those warm, wonderful expressions of sisterhood and brotherhood on Friday night? It has to deal with extraordinarily difficult, sometimes amoral decisions about statehood and sovereignty and national security, because its future has not yet been fully insured in its neighborhood. So this clash between, if you will, faith and sovereignty is also something which I think many American Jews have not fully understood, even as I dare say many Israelis continue to grapple with how does one balance the notion of Or LeGoyim, being a light unto the nations, with the nitty-gritty reality that as a state, it must survive and make difficult decisions every day that are morally, ethically challenging decisions.
Thank you, David. Thank you. For the sake of brevity, let me ask Isaac Herzog, who was the leader of once, of course, the strongest party in the country, the Labour Party, which today we don't even know if it would make it into the Knesset. Is there some basis maybe to what David just said, that more and more American Jews see Israel by the words of its prime minister, its, some of the politics which are more right-wing, which are more embracing American evangelicals? Is that maybe not so wrong, or do we see this?
So first of all, I agree with David's comments. They were very smart, and they depicted the whole, part of the root causes of this perception. We have to understand the following. We are in the midst. I mean, you're right on the verge of the ballot boxes in America. So clearly the emotions will be as high as possible. And when they are high as possible, both camps see only, colors of black and white, nothing else, no gray. But the truth of the matter is that in the political world that we live in, which is a very rough, aggressive world of politics, people tend to choose. Whilst the truth is that the love of Israel should be beyond any political argument, meaning you have to accept the fact that Israel is a very vibrant political system. I challenged Netanyahu for premiership in 2015. I almost won. I know why I didn't win, and I respect the Israeli voters' decision. And it has to do, a lot of it, in the perception of war and peace and who brings to us more security. This is a very vital issue which is not affecting American Jewish population in general. On the other hand, in America, there is a major political divide, major. It impacts the way people view who is with Trump and who is against Trump. And I've been telling every community I visited, please go way and above Netanyahu and Trump, because they are the immediate, but we have to look for the future. Then there are many other undercurrents, which David touched upon. And these undercurrents have impact our being in universities and campuses. There's a whole effort to delegitimize the whole right of the Jews to have their own nation state. People do not understand the Israeli political system. When I tell opposers on campus that we have a Muslim Brotherhood party in our parliament, people are awed. It's the only Muslim Brotherhood party in the world which is legitimate, because our democracy is as far as possible, but people don't get it, because why would the New York Times report about it? And therefore, I think people need to deliver the message of learning more, understanding more, and understanding that the immediate does not count for the fact that Israel should stay central in the heart of Jewish people.
Thank you. And Delphine Horvilleur, sorry. I also noticed that in Europe, of course, there is an increasing trend of many Jewish voters going to the right, or sometimes even extreme right. And I don't know if you want to comment on this, or how in general the political divide or not divide how would you portray today between the French Jewish diaspora and Israel?
Yeah. First of all, I want to react. I was now listening to the exchange, and I'm going to put on my rabbinic hat for a second. You know, in the Talmud, there's this notion of Kol Israel arevim ze leze, this idea that the entire people of Israel should feel responsible for each other and should feel how much each one's fate is related to one another. And I think it's relevant for our discussion. Last time we met in Israel, Isaac, I don't know if you remember, we talked about it. Actually, in Bereshit, in the parasha of the week, there is this sentence that keeps coming back. You know, the world is created in Bereshit, and the sentence that keeps coming back, the verse is Vayehi erev, vayehi boker, yom, etc., etc. It was evening and it was morning, and a new day was coming. And it's interesting that in Hebrew, the word erev has something to do with arevut, like evening could be translated as responsibility, and boker has something to do with bikoret, which in Hebrew means criticism or self-criticism. And I love this idea that a new world is created in Bereshit when you can say that there is responsibility for each other, common fate, but there is also ability to criticize or to be self-critical. And then there is a new day that can come. And I think we're exactly there, like in terms of political criticism toward Israel or the diaspora has to come both with the recognition that we share our fate and are responsible for each other, but also that we should be able to handle criticism in all time. And I think this is something that can be very meaningful for us all today. And you're right, in Europe and France also has to deal with these political tensions in recent years. I think French Jews mainly had to deal with the fact that Zionism somehow around us in France and in Europe became a very dirty word. You know, people were not able anymore to know exactly what people mean when they say they're Zionist or anti-Zionist. You know, I remember, for example, myself, so many times I had to stop a conversation with someone who told me he or she is anti-Zionist, and I had to stop the conversation asking the person to say exactly, you know, what do you mean when you say you're a Zionist or anti-Zionist? We don't know anymore what people mean through this word. And but mainly I think in Europe the big discussion is probably around anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and how do we handle today anti-Semitism. Actually, maybe we'll reach that question now, but it's a very critical moment to talk today about anti-Semitism. Yesterday in Paris, I don't know if you heard, the entire Rue de Rivoli, like the major street in the center of Paris, was covered with swastikas signs. And it's quite interesting, I don't know if interesting is the right word, that in this time of sanitary crisis and coronavirus crisis, all these news around anti-Semitism in Europe seem to go, you know, underground. Suddenly we don't talk about it because it seems very secondary, but we should really be aware today of what is going on.
Thank you, and that reminds me actually of you have written on this perspective, really from a long perspective on the way of anti-Semitism today. In your book, I don't even know, is it out in English also?
It will be out in English. It should be out by early 2021. So
okay. It's really very profound, and I can just recommend.
By the way, Delphine's books are bestsellers in France. You should know that.
And I would like now to turn to your question. We don't have that much time, but I do ask Laura Cutler, our managing director, to read maybe 2 or 3 questions, and I would ask you for brief answers to the question. Laura?
Hello, everyone. So I'm going to combine 3 questions into one because they're getting at the same issue. A junior at American University, Lindsay Schwalson, asks for any of the panelists, given that the government's been largely controlled by the right wing and religious bloc, and it does not seem to be changing anytime soon. Do you see a future where there's a successful change in Israel to become more secular and welcoming to more denominations? Norman Lipoff asks along the same lines, is there any signs of recognition by the ultra-religious political parties in Israel of pluralism? And I think the final one gets to something, maybe there is an answer in this that Delphine was talking about earlier. What motivated the discussion, this is from Wendy Hall, between Rabbi Delphine and her ultra-Orthodox colleague from his perspective in particular? So what can we see as bringing together the Jewish world in Israel?
So if I can answer briefly, first of all, in all nations, or nations are going through evolutions and processes. It's like asking, what will be in America, in the American political scene. In 2013, you had a truly liberal government. The ultra-Orthodox were not even there until 2013. So, because there are contradictory streams in Israel and a lot of evolutionary processes and a lot of questions on the agenda, the political system is built in a certain way. Right now we have a national unity government after 3 elections where each bloc could not get a victory. What does that mean? It means the nation is split in the middle. Okay, and this national unity government is 50-50, totally, as we call it, paritetic, and every decision must be taken mutually. Therefore, there will be no decision that will hurt or prejudice religious freedom in Israel. The question of the ultra-Orthodox establishment versus the Rabbanut is one of the questions, but as David mentioned correctly, there are many other questions on the Israeli agenda. And many things can change in the Israeli political and public scene. I won't bore you now, we don't have much time, but there are many, many changes all the time on many fronts, on many issues, including issues of the attitude towards the other, on many issues towards the other. And this is an evolution in society. I invite you post-COVID to all to come to Israel and learn so much more and understand so much more. But I do not agree that it's only a one-way street. By the way, in America, there is a major substantial growth by the ultra-Orthodox communities, and so much so that in a historical step, for the first time, an ultra-Orthodox party participate in the Zionist elections and is playing a very substantial role in the building of the coalition in all of the Zionist institutions, the JNF and the Sochnut and the World Zionist Organization and so forth. So that's another change, and it comes from America. So we have to understand that the world is changing and nations are changing too.
I think it's Isaac, you're bringing forth a very interesting, also philosophical question. More generally, is like, how does change occur? Does change happen from inside the system, or does it come from a pressure outside the system? And I think it can be both. I'll give you a personal testimony. I've been a rabbi in France for 12 years now. And for me, everything changed when as you can imagine, the Orthodox institutions in France are not really fond of the idea of a female rabbi being a religious leader in France. But things changed for me when suddenly I published many books and I became more recognized by the public power and by the media. And somehow the fact that I gained recognition from society, generally speaking in France, forced somehow a recognition inside the Jewish community. So sometimes changes happens because the system is pressured from the outside. And sometimes it happens from inside. And to answer the question that was asked about my conversation with Rabbi Eliezer Melamed, it happened because we met in Jerusalem about a year ago in a meeting between different denominations. And we had very nice discussions. And I think somehow it kept in memory this personal discussion we had. And sometimes, sometimes the difference is made simply by, personal relation you build, like from inside the system. I don't know if what I'm trying to say now is clear, but I believe that change sometimes happens from external pressure, and sometimes it happens because simply of an encounter, like a human meeting.
So, Michael, my answer to the various questions is. I don't think that there is an easy or obvious answer. I know that Americans in particular always like happy endings to stories. And I would like to suggest that there is a happy ending. And I'm Jewish enough to believe that we have to want to believe that change is possible. But I think, first of all, the issue of the place of call it the Haredi population in Israel, is not one that's going to be solved overnight. It's one that, from my perspective at least, poses one of the great societal challenges for Israel over the long term, especially given demographic trends. And that's why the efforts to bring further education, secular education, vocational education, national service, military service becomes even more important looking ahead. Number two, for me, unlike for at least some American Jews, that's not a turnoff to moving away from Israel and saying, until Israel solves these issues, I have no interest in Israel. For me, Michael, it's an encouragement to become even more involved. Because for those of us who approach this from the sense of Ahavat Yisrael, love of Israel, the notion of what a Jewish state means. We know what a democratic state means, I think. But what a Jewish and democratic state means is really, let's be honest with ourselves, up for grabs. There is more than one way of defining what that Jewish state is and ought to be. So if it's in contention, as it is, those of us who care deeply about Israel, I think have to be involved. And then I would just add two quick points. Number one, these issues are not limited, of course, to Israel. When my family and I lived in Geneva, Switzerland, a city that Isaac also knows well, we attended a liberal synagogue. And then, to our dismay, we discovered that the liberal congregation in Geneva and in Zurich at the time were not recognized by the umbrella body of Swiss Jewry. They were excluded. And even as we were talking at the time about growing anti-Semitism, growing anti-Zionism, here was this small community of Jews in Switzerland, and even within the community, there were the issues of non-recognition. And the last point is, right now as we speak in New York, we have a major COVID-19 crisis involving the segments of the Haredi population in New York. It's been very much in the news, very much in the news. And I think it underscores, among other things, Michael, the very wide gap between the Haredi communities, at least some of them, and the rest of the Jewish community. So when people call me, for example, from the American Jewish Committee and say, do something about what's going on, the desire is there. Believe me, the impulse is there. But practically speaking, it's not clear what we can do because the bridges of communication, much less understanding, are very, very few. So we have our work cut out. But again, for us, for me, it's not a reason to walk away. It's a reason to become even more involved.
Thank you. And so we do have to end it here. I know we only scratched the surface, barely scratched the surface. That's actually why our students come and take, semester-long classes so we can discuss these issues more in depth. And I encourage, of course, all our students to take classes on Israel, which we offer. But I think it gave us food for thought, for further thought. And this is to be continued. In one of the Q&A, one person suggested, which I think is a good one, to continue this amongst students. Maybe, we have Israeli students, we have European Jewish students, and we have American Jewish students. That could be a nice way to bridge it to the next generation. But I want to thank you all. We will continue this discussion. We will hear much about it in the future. I want to thank you. I know your time is precious. I want to thank you very much for participating.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Stay in touch.
Good to be with you, Isaac and Delphine. Thank you, Michael and Laura.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.